So in this framing video, what I wanted to do actually was comment a little bit less on our past voice thread on features of print culture and instead do a little bit more work to set us up for our discussion, particularly of Galileo's trial. So very briefly, regarding print culture, the main thing that I wanted to say is that I think it's really interesting that these features, we can kind of break them up. But as you're listening to the discussions and as you're reading the chapters, I think one of the things that might strike you is that it's really hard to separate them out, right? There's a lot of connections and a lot of ways they work together in tandem. So at a sort of purely theoretical level, we can kind of talk about these distinct features of print culture, but I do think that it's worth pointing out that if we're thinking about sort of what the lived experience of print culture is like, it's really hard to separate them very clearly or neatly, and that in many cases they're working together to create a particular kind of experience. So I actually think that is kind of an important point, and I wanted to flag it, but it's just something to sort of be thinking about and sort of having in your head as you move forward. We're going to be moving on now to discuss Eisenstein's account of the impact of print on science, like the development of modern science. And one of the things that we're going to be talking a lot about there is Galileo Galilei's trial. And before I talk too much about that, I wanted to say that there's actually this common pitfall that students kind of can fall into, and not just students, like everyone, like even sometimes I can think in these ways too. And I don't think that, in fact, I think it's actually not helpful to frame the discussion in these terms. So I wanted to kind of talk about it at the outset and explain why I don't think that's an appropriate model. So when we think a lot about Galileo's trial, especially as it's portrayed, it's not like it's portrayed commonly, but as it's portrayed in popular culture, it tends to be framed as this conflict between science and religion, right? So Galileo is portrayed as the sort of voice of the scientific method and reason, and then there's the church, which is sort of this power of orthodoxy and religion and faith, right? And they're there's this clash of these two things. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that it's probably this is not really what the trial itself was about, right? So Galileo himself was a deeply religious person, and he genuinely thought of the work that he was doing as a way of studying the works of God, and he thought of that as kind of a particular homage, right? It was its own kind of worship, right? So it's not like he's trying to sort of champion science over religion. That's not what he thinks he's doing. Nor is it the case that the church was at that time generally antagonistic to science or studying the world, right? So these things are not necessarily coming into conflict. But what is happening is that there are a lot of shifting ideas about religion and worship, and particularly about the role of individuals. So part of the reason that Galileo gets in trouble, I think, is simply because of these sorts of undercurrents that are sort of tracking issues with the Reformation, right? So the Reformation really was this view that individuals should be able to read the Bible and form their own beliefs, and they should be able to pray, and you can have a personal relationship with God, right? You can, and that this was an important part of it, whereas the church up until that point had sort of held that lay persons, just regular folks like me and you probably shouldn't read the Bible, right? Because you have a priest who's been trained by the church who can read the Latin, and that's why masses were in Latin, right? You were there, but you didn't need to know what was being said, and if you needed advice or guidance, you should just go ask your priest, and he would tell you what to do on the basis of the sort of received, well-studied, authoritative account of what the Bible says, right? And so there are these shifting views of authority and how we know things that are happening right now. And certainly Galileo probably gets caught in those undercurrents. But it's not necessarily about this controversy between religion and science in the way that, like, coming from our modern perspective, we might want to read into it. And so I think it's a good idea to flag that, like, before you get started with the readings, because, you know, it's easy to think about things the way they are today and then look back and go, oh, yeah, it's probably like this, right? And there are really very different value tensions in play than what we might see happening today, insofar as there are perceived conflicts between science and religion. So I wanted to flag that. As you are going through and doing this voice thread and thinking about Galileo's trial, I wanted to give you some clues and some tips for sort of framing it and how you think about it. So one of the most important questions that I think you can be asking yourself as you're thinking about Galileo and his works is to ask yourself this question about control. Who has control over what in this particular little mini saga, right? Particularly over, like, who has control over Galileo's works and how people read them and what they think. And this is going to be a question that's very important later on, too, as we're thinking about Adrian Johns. So you can ask yourself, like, well, you know, like, is there any control? Who has, like, and, you know, maybe there's not, right? If there is control, what is it over and who has it, right? And importantly, what are the consequences of like different kinds of control and who does it impact? So I think that this is a really nice way to frame the readings as you're going through and thinking about it. And we're going to be talking about that more in the readings. I also want to point out that a lot of this discussion is going to hang on this idea of what I will call technological determinism. So as Eisenstein is writing and talking about the impact of print on science, one of the things that, like, you'll kind of get a sense of, I think, is that Eisenstein tends to think that many of the consequences of print are kind of inevitable, right? Like, she thinks that, like, well, yeah, you know, there's this new technology, and then this stuff happens, and of course, like, the reason that this stuff happens was because of the technology. Like, it was the technology that did it. And this is roughly known in different kinds of academic circles as technological determinism. And it's the idea that technology can cause changes in society. And it's widely regarded as sort of an untenable, not very reasonable view. And people have kind of tried to flesh out other relationships between technology and society, that either technology has basically no impact on society and it's all about people, or you can have this sort of more give and take kind of dynamic account, like feedback mechanisms between the two. But a lot of the criticisms that surround Elizabeth Eisenstein's work is that she comes off as too much of a technological determinist. And so as you're reading, I think it would be interesting for you to be thinking about that question. Like, does Eisenstein think that these changes are a direct and only a result of the technology? And if so, do you think she's right about that? I mean, maybe there are cases where actually technological determinism is absolutely correct, you know? So I think that that's sort of an important question that you might want to be thinking about as you go through the readings for this week.